Tell the photographer to keep the bride's father out of frame, Brandon says. PR doesn't need a thrift store vibe in the campaign shots. For one suspended breath, the ballroom forgets to exist. Then laughter cracks open brittle metallic, the kind that ricochets off chandeliers and glass walls like broken coins. I sense Lily before I see her. The faint shiver in her flute's stem, her perfume slicing cleanly through the overripe roses crowding the backdrop. I know she wishes she could rewind the last few seconds, as if a well-timed smile could erase sound. It never does. The photographer blinks too fast, trapped between paycheck and propriety. His assistant half raises a hand, uncertain whom to obey, uncertain whether brand safety now includes keeping fathers invisible. I stand just beyond the taped line where family is arranged into something photogenic, a product. Brandon's tux fits him like a verdict. He doesn't look at me when he speaks. But he knows I heard no's, everyone did. 30 years old and already convinced that confidence is a moral virtue. Maybe you're right. I say, my voice even, but carrying though, sometimes the background is what gives a picture its worth. The laughter dies first in the mouths that birthed it. Someone coughs. Lily's eyes flick toward me, a brief apology she prays no one else will see. She is 29, luminous in a gown the color of moonlight, trembling on water. When she was small, she used to hook her arms around my neck in the kitchen and announce that no picture was complete without both of us in it. She believed that even when our house was crowded with hospital bills and fear and soup that we pretended was dinner. Gregory Hale watches from the bar, a glass of amber light in his hand. He doesn't move when his son speaks. Doesn't move when I answer. Only a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, irritation or calculation. 62 and fluent in the price of correcting a son in public. Fluent too in the price of not. He stays silent, sips, and lets the moment drift past like a minor market dip. A woman in sequins drifts near, complimenting my tie. It feels authentic, she says. I thank her and wonder when authenticity became something you could rent by the hour. The photographer calls for immediate family. The Hale side gathers first silver navy and the relaxed composure of people who have never been told they don't belong in rooms like this. Executives from Hale Technologies glide in smiles rehearsed to the millimeter, their watches catching the same thread of light. Lily steps out of the frame and finds me near a small table by the wall. I'm sorry, Dad. He was just trying to be funny. I've met funny, I tell her. That wasn't it. Her mouth tightens, then softens. Please, just help me get through tonight. I'm here, I say. I always am. The speeches begin. Gregory speaks of a legacy rooted in this city. A river of innovation that carries us all. He calls Brandon a leader. Lily a steadying force. I stand with my hands behind my back and remember when vision was something you protected, not something you branded. Then Brandon takes the mic, a man who's never had to win a room twice. He tells the story of meeting Lily in a Capitol Hill cafe, how she always sat by the window, because light mattered to her. He jokes that she must have gotten that from her dad, who's famous for keeping to himself. The audience laughs, laughter on cue built into the event like stage lighting. I swallow, feel it land somewhere under my ribs. There comes a point when a joke is only the truth wearing polished shoes. I step out onto the terrace as the music swells. The night air is cool, the city stretched below, like a circuit board lit by human ambition. I think of Maria of the kitchen table, where I once mapped the logic of algorithms and grief, both requiring patience that cuts deep. I think of the night Lily told me she was moving in with Brandon, and how I pretended my yes didn't splinter. The door opens behind me. Gregory steps out. He stands beside me in a silence almost respectful. "It's a beautiful night," he says. "It is." "Don't mind Brandon. The young sometimes confuse volume with substance. Does that line work on investors?" I ask. He gives a small, soundless laugh. "There's always room in this town for sharp minds. There's rarely room at the same table for sharp minds and clean consciences," I say. He nods once, the kind of nod that ends a meeting. "I should get back." And he does without looking at me. I stay with the skyline a while longer. When I return, the evening has slipped into its second act. The dance floor spins with choreographed ease. I stand in the kind light and watch my daughter laugh at something Brandon whispers. She looks young, sure of herself, and then for a second, she looks at me and that certainty wavers. Someone nearby murmurs that the partner from Austin is here. Another mentions a contract nearly closed. The quartet shifts into a standard that sounds like home, our old living room on a Sunday afternoon, when the world was still small enough to hold. Lily finds me again. One picture, Dad, away from the backdrop. Of course. We find a quiet patch of light that doesn't try too hard. She leans into my shoulder, the tremor in her body softening as the shutter clicks. She thanks the photographer, squeezes my hand, twice our old code for "I'm still here." People gather once more in the polished chaos of privilege. Brandon stands at the center, golden and composed. Gregory joins him, the calm of a man who always knows where the camera is pointed. The photographer adjusts the light waves for anyone lingering to step in. I take one step toward the taped line marking the edge of the frame, then stop. I smooth the old gray lapel that has followed me through gentler rooms. And for one long breath, I stay exactly there at the border, where a life can be centered or cropped, where the background waits patient for its turn to speak. It was 2018, and the monitors in Maria's hospital room hummed like tired bees. I learned the language of oncology without wanting it. Maria kept a small notebook by the bed and wrote 2 lines each morning, a thing she called proof of living. "Coffee tastes like courage today. Nathan is here. I was there. I was there for the scans and the infusions and the slow parade of specialists who used words that felt cleaner than the truth. I started selling what could be sold. The old piano that Lily learned on. The bikes we used by the waterfront. A box of lenses from when Maria thought she might take up photography again. I reached out to Gregory Hale because pride goes quiet when the arithmetic of your life turns cruel. Years earlier, we had worked together on a compression project that never saw daylight. He was a partner then, sharp and certain, a man who knew how to point capital at an idea and make the world behave. He remembered the work. He remembered me enough to take a meeting. The lobby of Hale Technologies smelled like cedar and coffee and momentum. Gregory came down rather than have me go up. He asked about Maria, and I told him the truth in a few clean sentences. I slid a stack of printouts across the table. NeuraLoop in its first living form. Benchmarks from my home lab. Early versions of the stream handling. I explained what I had built and what I believed it could become if someone with resources pushed it over the hill. Then he talked numbers. 35,000. He said distressed asset more than once. I looked at the pen in his hand and thought of Maria sleeping with her notebook open to a page that said the tea was too sweet, but you were here. I signed. He shook my hand and said we would take good care of it. I held the check that would buy us weeks, maybe months. I walked out into the glare of a Seattle afternoon and pretended my knees were not shaking. The world contracted to a handful of rooms, and then when it tried to expand again, it had lost its center. I stopped sleeping the way I used to. Nights became long corridors I walked without reaching a door. Work called me in for a meeting and thanked me for my years and gave me a packet that translated to, "You are on your own now." The rent was lower. The air felt less judged. I found an apartment that looked west, a small place where you could hear the freight trains in the evening. I cooked in a pan that had lost some of its non-stick and ate at a table that once held a birthday cake with 30 candles. Lily was 22 and beginning to step into rooms where surnames were credentials. She tried to protect me from the new gravity in her life. "Dad, it is a small dinner," she would say, and I would tell her I had work. I did not blame her. She was learning a dialect that punished hesitations. She wanted to move cleanly through it, and I represented every snag. When she brought Brandon by for the first time, he shook my hand like he was sealing a favorable term sheet and glanced around the apartment as if counting exits. Maria would have laughed in the kitchen later and called him Ernest with a question mark. I did not have the kitchen or the later. I kept writing code at night because grief needs something to push against, and code will push back without making a scene. I did not have the servers or the equipment from my previous life, but I had discipline and a stubborn curiosity that refused to retire. A way to adaptively tune blocks on the fly based on signal context rather than static assumptions. A method for cross-lane hints without choking the pipeline. I wrote to see if it held. Then I wrote more because it did. I did not tell anyone. Secrets are easier to keep when no one is watching. I kept a spiral notebook where I logged each experiment by hand. Time of day, hardware profile, throughput, power draw, notes about edge cases that misbehaved like children. The numbers began to draw a shape that looked like promise. I labeled a folder NeuraLoop 2.0 and then changed it to something colder so I would not jinx it. Spring turned to summer. I took long walks by the water when a problem refused to yield. I bought a used bike from a man who called me brother and learned the side streets of Tacoma the way you learn a language by listening. I called Lily every Sunday. Sometimes she answered. Sometimes she sent a text on Monday morning with a heart and a lightning bolt, as if that could stand in for a voice. One afternoon in late August, a link arrived in my inbox from a former colleague who still passed me scraps of news he thought I might miss. It was a keynote deck from a Hale Technologies developer conference, the kind they stream and then post with a triumphant soundtrack. I clicked and watched a bright young engineer explain a breakthrough in compression efficiency for mobile clients. He used phrases that felt like déjà vu. He showed a chart that looked like the one in my notebook, the one where the knee in the curve appears after you switch the order of two small but stubborn steps. He called it predictive lane coaxing. I had called it whisper lanes in a margin note as a joke for Maria. The engineer flipped to a code sample, and my breath stopped at a function name that was too odd to be common. I had written that name in a prototype during a week when I was sure nothing would ever work. It was not the same code, not copied, but the bones matched. The benchmarks matched. The timing of releases matched the window after I sold the first version and continued alone in the dark. I paused the video and stared at the still frame until the pixels felt hot. Maybe it was convergence. Good minds arriving at the same solution through the same bottleneck is a thing that happens. Maybe it was that. But the contour of the thing felt personal, like seeing your own gait in a stranger's shadow. I reopened the folder I had renamed and skimmed the logs. There it was. The date. The commit message that read, "Not yet, but close." The diagram where the arrow curved exactly the way it curved on their slide. I felt a thin thread tighten from my chest to the screen. Then I shut the laptop and sat very still in the late light, the apartment full of the sound of a freight train pushing through town on its own schedule. The room did not spin. It steadied. Something in me that had been tilted since the hospital clicked 1 degree closer to level. I did not have proof. I had a path. I would need to be careful. I would need to be patient. I would need to keep everything. I checked the lab schedule and wrote my name in small letters on the clipboard that hung from a nail. A man in a mariner's cap lifted the sheet like a fragile thing and said he did not think he could learn this. An older woman with a braid down her back said she had lost all her photos to a pop-up and was afraid to touch anything. I told her fear is a common language and we would translate it together. We practiced sending an email with a picture of a grandchild. We set up a calendar alert for a medication that had to be taken with food. We found the small triangle on a video that meant play and the square that meant stop. When the narrator voice on one machine suddenly began to read the screen in a stiff tone, the room startled and then laughed in relief when I showed them the key that turned it off. The laugh felt like warm water. A woman squeezed my arm and said that the internet had felt like a loud room, and now it felt like a library. I watched them leave through the double doors and thought that small triumphs have a sound, and if you are quiet, you can hear it. She said the wait list had crossed into the kind of number that made administrators nervous. She asked if I could add 2 evenings a week. She said the lab closes at 6, but she could keep a light on if I had work of my own. I told her I would be careful. She said she had 6 brothers and knew the difference between careful and reckless, and that I did not look like trouble. The public machines were sturdy and honest. I opened the cloud drive that did not know my history and pulled down a folder with a name that would bore anyone curious. When they failed, I wrote a question and left space after it like a doorway. Adaptive windowing stabilizes when input carries a lie. Stage 2 loses heat if the handoff is late. Do not trust the pretty line until it holds under noise. At 8, Sandra brought a chipped mug that said staff and set it by my elbow. She asked if the work was going well. I said it was like teaching a nervous dog to trust a hand patience and small movements and praise at the right time. I left at closing and walked home along a street that ran beside the water. I opened the old laptop, shifted the fan with a folded coaster, so the wine settled into a bearable pitch, and pushed the day's small gains to the place where nothing looked like me. I wrote the name Coal Creek, and under it I wrote another, Quiet Current. I filed the paperwork a day later in a small office where the clerk stamped things without looking up. I rented a post office box because privacy sometimes looks like a little metal door with a number on it. I opened a bank account with a balance that would not impress anyone and a sense of purpose that did not need an audience. I wrote a single-page agreement that described the software with care and space where a buyer might put a number and a date. I kept every scrap in a folder with a tab that read "Yoop." I published a small helper module under a name that would not lead home. It handled a streaming header that liked to misbehave on certain phones. The email arrived on a Thursday, with rain holding to the glass and the room smelling like leftover coffee. The sender had a name I recognized from conference programs I had never attended. He said he had seen the helper and that the style felt specific. He said the edges carried a hand he thought he had seen before. He said he might be wrong. He said I should check the boundaries of assignments I had signed years ago and make sure that whatever was new had an address that could be defended. He said some people with budgets and panic liked to file paperwork on things they did not make. He signed with his name and a title that carried weight at Hale Technologies. I read it twice. I could have written back with thanks and caution. I could have deleted it and told myself that attention was a risk I could not afford. Instead, I put the phone face down and opened the folder with the word "Keep" on the tab. I spread the contents across the table like maps. The conference deck where the slide felt like my diagram turned inside out. The notebook pages where the curve bent when I changed the order of 2 steps. The printed receipts for the LLC. The tiny bank balance. The draft agreement with its empty blanks. I let the pieces sit in the light, and I sat with them. At class the next day, a woman in a navy coat asked how to find a photo from a phone that no longer turned on. She had lost her husband the year before and had been afraid to try. We found a backup that she did not know she had, and there he was smiling at a backyard grill with a dog at his feet. She put a hand to her mouth, and her eyes filled, and she said she was sorry, and I told her there was nothing to be sorry for. She asked if she could print it and carry it in her wallet until she was brave enough to look at it without shaking. I showed her the steps and watched the printer feed the paper out with a dignity that felt holy. She pressed the photo to her chest and thanked me as if I had made the picture exist. When she left, she said, "Small wins keep you in one piece." That evening, I asked Sandra if I could reserve the lab late 2 nights each week. She studied my face and asked if my work would hurt her machines. I said it would not. She asked if I was building something that would invite trouble through the front doors. I said I was building something that would make other things quieter. She thought about that and nodded and wrote my name on the paper calendar with a blue pen. Tuesday and Thursday, she said, and I thanked her the way you thank someone who hands you a key. I filed a provisional patent a week later. The language was careful and plain. It did not reveal more than the shape of the idea. I mailed it at the post office where the clerk wore a tie with little palm trees and moved like a man pacing himself for a long day. I walked out into a morning that smelled like wet concrete and new bread and felt the world tilt a fraction toward order. When I got home, another email waited from the director. He wrote that he had no interest in causing me harm. He wrote that he had spent years watching good work disappear into contracts that were designed to keep it quiet. He wrote that if I needed a second set of eyes on a document, he would read and tell me where the holes might be, and he would forget he had done it. I read it twice and set the phone down on the table. Across the street, a neighbor carried a sleeping child from a car to a front door and did not wake them. The act looked like a kind of worship. I did not respond. I made a folder named Signals and moved the messages there. I sat with the feeling that help might exist and that accepting it could be a kind of risk that did not fit my plan. I sharpened my plan instead. I cleaned comments that sounded like me out of the public code. I renamed one function that would have felt like a fingerprint to anyone who had watched me work years ago. I committed clean and pushed. That night, the lab lights rose and settled, and the terminals came alive in the order I knew by heart. The fan on my machine lifted and fell with my typing, like a steady breath shared by 2 people who trust each other. The numbers shifted into alignment, the way a stubborn cabinet door finally learns its hinge. Outside, the rain found a new rhythm on the glass. I wrote until the screen logged me out, and the room went dark at the edges, and the book drop clattered and then rested. I packed the notebook and the folder, and the small sense that a door had opened someplace I could not yet name. Then I stood in the dim and listened to the building breathe, and let the quiet decide the next move with me. He said he would broker a call, and that I should expect a request for an NDA so heavy it would bend my inbox. I said yes. My voice came out even. He nodded like that was the only answer that made sense. I signed and scanned and waited for the next ask. The next ask was a plane ticket, which I declined. I told them I preferred to keep my feet near the water in Tacoma and my head clear of rooms where people perform intelligence for sport. They did not argue. They asked me to walk them through design choices that made no sense on first glance, and perfect sense on the 100th. I talked until my throat was dry, and then I listened while they ran shape tests I had not seen, and found the same calm bends in the same places. Interviews with people who knew compression the way a surgeon knows tissue. Whiteboard sessions that became text on a shared screen because I did not have a whiteboard. Late-night runs with devices that overheated or refused, and then learned how to behave. They sent a small team to Seattle once, and we sat in a rented room at a co-working space with a bad view of a beautiful city. On the third day, a woman with a calm voice said it works, and a silence followed that I felt in my chest. On the legal side, they brought in a specialist. Marissa Grant was 58 and had the look of someone who had spent a career reading fine print aloud to people who thought they understood English. She asked for every document I had ever signed with Hale Technologies. She asked for versions and dates and the names of witnesses. She took the old contract apart like a clock and showed me the pieces on the table. This clause says the sale was of a defined set that included only enumerated elements. This clause does not reach future development outside that set. She met with the ventures team and a separate team with more serious titles. She told them she would need a clean entity and a clean chain of title and a way to close that made it hard for anyone to claim surprise. The name felt borrowed, and that was the point. The term sheet came on a Tuesday morning that smelled like wet cedar. I read it twice at my small table. 150 million. There were tranches and taxes and words that described risks I knew by heart. There was a clause that touched the part of me that had stayed small since the hospital room. Founder identity to be disclosed at a set time controlled by the buyer and calibrated for market communications. She said we could ask for a time that meant something to me. I asked for 5 in the evening on April 14, 2025. I said it was the day my daughter would pledge herself to a future that had a last name that once made me feel small. Negotiations lasted weeks and also forever. Lines moved and then held. I asked that a portion of the price be earmarked for educational licenses that would cost nothing for a program I would design for women who wanted to enter this industry late and did not know where to begin. The ventures team said that was outside of standard practice. The line moved and stayed. I slept better that night than I had in a year. There were days I felt like a fraud. Days I waited for someone to announce that my work was a trick of lighting. On those days, I went to the library and taught a class and watched a grandmother send a photo she thought she had lost. After class, I opened the terminal at the end and ran a test and watched the fan lift and fall like a small promise. He asked once if Maria would have liked him. I said she would have made him eat, and then asked questions he would answer without noticing. The last month felt like the slow click of a safe. Security asked questions that felt like riddles. An ethics officer asked about the people I would hire if I ever built a team. I told her I would pick people who listened like workers and treated silence as a teacher. She wrote that down. I was not sure if I had answered a question or confessed a religion. We signed the definitive agreement in March in a conference room in a building with windows that looked toward the sound. I watched my name travel through the document and return changed. Miller Innovations became Cole Innovations, LLC, with the swing of a pen that moved across tablets and screens. The wire instructions sat like a dare. Marissa watched me sign and said, "Steady." I was steady. I put the phone face down and looked at the water. There were conditions that kicked in like small gears while we slept. Code in escrow, benchmarks filed, a communication plan with bullet points that I did not have to deliver. It included a line about the founder whose name would be revealed at a time coordinated with other communications. I read it and put it back in the folder. I had a different truth that would not fit in the space allotted. The morning of April 14th arrived with a light rain and a calendar reminder that blinked 5 p.m. in a small square like a lighthouse. I sat at my table with a pen and the closing packet. Marissa called to say the final signatures would be released at 9 and that the wire would hit by noon. I said thank you in a voice that sounded like someone who had learned to hold happiness without breaking it. The wire appeared in my account at 11:38. The number looked absurd, and then solemn, like a flag lowered to half-mast for a holiday you could not explain to a child. I checked the escrow confirmation. I signed the last page and sent it back to the team. The city moved as if nothing had changed. A neighbor carried a laundry basket to a coin machine. A bus hissed and knelt for someone with a cane. At 1, I ironed the shirt Lily had insisted I wear. The one she said looked like I had been expecting to be photographed for years. I thought about the way she had pressed her face into my shoulder as a child in rooms full of adults, and declared that pictures needed both of us. I thought about the way she looked at me now across rooms where money sat like furniture. I folded the shirt into my bag and checked the time again. There was nothing left to sign. The quiet felt large and kind. Somewhere in Mountain View, a communications person had a finger poised above a button that would turn private into public. Somewhere in Seattle, a ballroom was being staged for a story about a future that had forgotten one of its authors. The rain eased. The light in the apartment shifted. I held the confirmation in my hand and let the weight of it settle where it belonged. Lily texted that she was outside. I locked the apartment and carried the garment bag the tailor had given me last week, the one with the temporary stitches that still needed a final pass. She said final fitting, then flowers, then a stop at the hotel to check the room assignment. She said we would be quick if we did not get sentimental. The shop in Bellevue smelled like cedar and patience. He knew Lily by name. We moved to a small platform with a triptych mirror. He stepped back and let his face settle into something impressed. Lily smiled too quickly and said we were still deciding on accessories. The associate adjusted the sleeve and pinned the cuff with a quick twist of his fingers. He asked me to lift my arms. He smoothed the fabric and said the shoulders were clean, that the waist could come in a whisper. I thought of the way Lily had chosen this tie last week and set it against 3 different shirts until she said, "This one looks like you." I kept still while he circled me with straight pins. Lily stood a few steps back, the notebook pressed to her hip. She said the Hale family would have photographers and partners and board members in the room, and that no one loved a mistake like the internet. She said Brandon had ideas for the campaign shots, and that the firm had a style guide that would keep us in the right lane. I said the tie would do. Lily looked at the mirror and then passed to the mirror. She wrote something and snapped the notebook closed. He chalked a small mark near the seam and asked me to sit, and then stand testing the line. He asked about shoes, and I said, I had a pair that had been resold twice. He said he liked that, and that shoes with memory tell the camera that a person has arrived somewhere on purpose. At the register, he folded the suit into the bag and slid it over the counter like a gift. He thanked Lily by name again, and thanked me by sir. On our way out, he said again that the tie was quietly excellent. Lily said thank you without letting the words settle. We sat in the car and let the silence hold for one intersection. Lily adjusted the vent and said she wanted tonight to be perfect. I said image often reflects what we fear facing. She looked at the road. I said I was not a test. She kept her eyes on the lane markers and said yes, but rooms have rules. We merged onto the highway and the car hummed into a steadier sound. I told her I was there for her. I said I could stand where I was put and breathe. I said love was not worried about camera angles. She blew out a breath and said she knew. She said she did not know how to say what came next without making it worse. I waited. She said she had told Brandon that her dad was not comfortable in those rooms. She said she had said it because she wanted him to understand me, to be kind, to keep the pressure off. She said she had said it, and then watched his face and seen how the information slid into some box where strategy lives. She said she had not meant it to become a reason to place me at the edge of frames. She said it anyway. I looked at the water and the boats sitting at attention in their slips. I told her thank you for telling me. My voice sounded like someone stepping carefully. I said that language has a way of leaving the mouth and finding a job. I said that people who live by image like to hire language for tasks that are not good for the soul. She said she was sorry. She said she had wanted to protect me and also herself, and that the two things were braided in a way she could not cut apart. I told her I would be fine. I said I had been in rooms that smelled worse and had survived. I said that tonight I would stand where she needed me, and if some part of the room asked me to be smaller, I would remember Maria and my notebook, and the fact that the world is larger than any lens. Lily choked on a small sound, a laugh or a sob, and then she steadied. We pulled off the highway and into the city. Lily parked in a garage that smelled like rubber and rain. We sat with the engine off for a minute longer than needed. She reached into the back seat and handed me a small box. Inside was a pocket square, the color of a calm sky. She said she thought it might make the tie feel intentional. I said it already was. I folded the square the way Maria had taught me, a clean line that did not try too hard. We walked to the elevator and watched the numbers climb and stop and climb. In the lobby, Lily checked her list and spoke to a coordinator who seemed to glide rather than walk. I watched the mountain we were climbing without gear. On the ride to the hotel where guests would gather, Lily drove with both hands, even though she usually steered with one. She asked me to promise that if Brandon said something careless, I would let it pass. She said sometimes he mistook timing for charm. I said I would not ruin her night. She said it was not mine to ruin. She winced when she heard herself and then reached for my hand where it rested on my knee. She squeezed twice the way she used to when she was small, and storms scared her. I squeezed back, and the memory softened the edges of the present. We stopped at a light, and the crosswalk filled with people who looked like they trusted traffic to behave. Lily watched them and said that after tonight, things would be simpler. She said that was probably a lie, and that she hoped it would be a kind one. I looked at her profile and saw Maria there for a second, the same line of concentration, near the mouth, the same stubborn tenderness. I thought of 5 o'clock, and the message that had said almost time, and how truth sometimes walks into a room dressed like coincidence. The hotel came up on the right, all glass and confidence. Valets in dark suits moved in smooth loops, opening doors, and handing out claim tickets like magicians. Lily pulled to the curb, and the world brightened by a fraction, as if the building had changed the weather. She put the car in park and left it running. She looked at me and then at the lobby, and then back at me. She said we can still turn around if you want. I said I was here. I always was. She nodded, and the nod felt like a truce between what we feared and what we were willing to do anyway. The valet opened her door. She handed me the garment bag and I stepped out into the curated light. For a breath, we stood beside the car and let the scene build. Without us, the two of us, a small still point before the room decided where to place us. A woman in black with a tablet appeared at Lily's elbow and said the coordinator needed her at the floral arch. The ballroom opened to brightness. Tables glowed under low arrangements of white and green. Lily was pulled into a circle of women in satin who kissed her cheek and admired the ring. Brandon stood with two men near the head table and took their backslaps like currency. Place cards called us to our chairs. I found mine 2 seats from Lily across from a partner whose cufflinks had initials and tiny stones that caught the chandelier. He asked where I worked these days, and I told him the truth in a sentence that felt calm. A bell somewhere hummed us toward attention. Gregory stepped to the stage first. He spoke about legacy and the city and the power of 2 families becoming one. He thanked the staff without looking up. He praised Lily for her steadiness and Brandon for his vision. The room nodded along, happy to be told what it already believed. He raised his glass, and the sound of crystal gave the quartet a rest. Brandon took the microphone. He thanked everyone for making room in their calendars and room in their hearts, and the room obliged with a warm sound. He told the story of seeing Lily in a Capitol Hill coffee shop 2 summers ago, her notebook open and a soft pencil tucked behind her ear. He said she was brilliant and grounded and kept him honest about what mattered. He said families are systems and optics can be a real thing, and everyone in the room knows it. He said when 2 worlds meet, there is always a little static, and sometimes there is a feature that does not match the product shot. He said, we are all learning, and some of us are still getting comfortable in rooms like this, and that is all right, as long as the picture overall is clean. I felt Lily's shoulder blades tense from 2 chairs away. Someone whispered, say it into the mic, and he lifted his glass again, enjoying the way attention felt in his hand. I looked at Lily. Her smile had become a thing she was holding up for someone else. Her eyes flicked to mine, and away fast, as if any contact could spill what she was trying to carry. I set my napkin on the table and rose. My chair scraped softly, and the quartet paused just long enough for silence to become a living animal. I kept my voice even and let it travel far enough to find the corners. I hope you learn real value before you lose what you cannot buy back. Gregory's jaw found a new angle. Someone coughed and then decided not to. The phones did not drop. Some of them lifted higher. I let the silence walk a few more feet, then I stepped away from the table and toward the side doors where the air did not smell so busy. I leaned a palm against cool marble and breathed the way grief had taught me, in through the nose and out through patience. A staff member with a tray of champagne flutes slowed and asked if I needed anything. I told him I needed a minute. Behind me, the ballroom hummed back to life, but the frequency had shifted. I could feel it through the soles of my shoes. She scrolled and then made a small, bright sound. She showed her friend the screen. It was the earlier moment by the backdrop, the stray sentence offered to the photographer, like a label on a jar. PR does not need a thrift store vibe for the campaign shots. The audio was clear. A comment popped up with clapping hands and a, please tell me this man is not real. Another asked, who is the father? He looks like a professor. The friend laughed and said, this is going to cook, then held the phone higher to catch the reflections in the hallway mirrors. The coordinator with the tablet slid past and then came back when she saw me. She said the program was about to move to first dances and asked if I needed to know where to stand. I told her I knew where I stood. I walked to the terrace doors and stepped into air that belonged to the sound and not to anyone's planner. Somewhere below, a delivery truck made the long sigh of hydraulic brakes. I could see into the ballroom through the glass. Lily stood near the edge of the dance floor, while a bridesmaid dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue that had never touched a tear. My phone throbbed in my pocket with the insistence of a small animal. Messages from numbers I knew and numbers I did not. Peter had sent a link without commentary. Marissa had sent a line that said, do not engage. A neighbor from my building had written, is this you? I watched the clip on Peter's link and heard the sentence again from inside the screen. It sounded even cheaper the second time. A young man in a tux stepped out to smoke and then saw me and put the lighter back in his pocket, as if he had been caught drawing on a wall. He said I did right. He said people forget rooms are real places, not feeds. He said congratulations in a way that suggested he did not know yet why. I nodded, and he fled back inside. The band shifted into a classic, and the floor attempted romance. I could see the glow of more phones now lifted at chest height, and then higher eyes narrowing as comments refreshed, and tiny hearts flooded like fish. A woman at a corner table whispered to a man beside her and tipped her screen. He frowned and then put on a neutral expression, so complete it felt rehearsed. I went back in because absence has its own optics, and I would not lend anyone that story. People made a space as I moved as if courtesy had suddenly grown teeth. I took my seat and set my hands on the table. Lily slid into the chair beside me even though her card said otherwise. She stared at the tablecloth and said she was sorry into her lap. I said we would get to the other side of tonight. She looked like a person trying to keep a sail from tearing. She said, "Do not fight him." I said, I did not need to. Across the room, Brandon lifted his hand to request the mic again, and the coordinator hesitated, then surrendered. He tried to paste a fresh layer over the moment. He thanked the families for their grace and the guests for being part of the story. He said his earlier comments had landed wrong, and that he had meant only to celebrate the many shapes of love in a modern world. The language sounded like something an assistant had said to say. The room offered a polite hum. The phones did not drop. At our table, a woman in a pale dress told a man that her cousin in Austin had already sent the clip. A man in navy said it was on a startup gossip account that likes to call out tone-deaf moments. Someone else said the comments were split, that some called it a joke, and others called it a mask slipping. The quartet ended the song, and the DJ took over. Applause rose on cue and fell just shy of genuine. I excused myself and walked through a line of potted palms. In the hallway, a security guard spoke softly into a mic clipped to his lapel. A woman from the hotel staff asked a colleague whether a press person had called the front desk. Someone said the PR team wanted a statement ready in case the clip crossed out of local into national. The clock over the service door marked the minute in a clean hand. The hour leaned toward late afternoon. Inside the ballroom, the first dance began, Lily's dress swinging in a small circle of safety, while 100 eyes and 30 cameras tried to own the moment. I stood near the door with one palm on the cool frame and let the noise thin until I could hear the faint hiss of the vents. The song ended, and the applause rose and fell, and rose again for the next pair. I stayed where the light from the corridor met the noise from the room and waited for the sound that would matter more than any of this. The minute hand moved a little farther. The building seemed to take a breath and hold it. First the light shifted, and then every phone in the room buzzed in a shared tremor. A young man at a table near the stage lifted his screen so high it caught chandelier light. Tech Today confirms Google DeepMind acquires NeuraLoop from Hale Innovations for $150 million. Lily's phone lit blue against her dress. She looked down and then up and found me. Her mouth formed the shape of my name, without sound. He stepped a few feet into the room, and someone with a headset checked his name on a list, and then checked it again. Gregory was the last to look. He lifted it with 2 fingers and read with his chin set. He tapped the link and the press release opened on his screen. He scrolled once and stopped. Hale Innovations, LLC. Founder to be revealed at 5 Pacific. I saw the memory arrive in his face. He had believed the story would stay told. He had believed this chapter would never ask for a revision. A partner in a navy dress said, "Is that the bride's father?" And the man beside her said, "It cannot be." A junior investor at the end of the head table whispered, "I think it is," and looked at me with a new kind of arithmetic. Brandon reached for Lily's elbow, and she did not move. He said something to her that tried to sound like care. Her face did a small tightening, and then smoothed. He lifted his glass, as if he might pour charm onto the table and make it shine. The sentence on his lips did not find the light. Phones were taking it from him. Peter stepped closer and asked if I wanted him to tell the coordinator or if I would. I told him this room already knows. He nodded once and said, "For the record, I can confirm." He spoke in the voice professionals use when the truth has arrived and only needs a clear path. He said that the founder of Cole Innovations is present. He did not say my name until a face he knew from Tech Today appeared at his shoulder and asked twice. Then he said, "Nathan Cole," and he said it the way people say a name that has waited too long to be said. The effect was not loud. It was a settling. Chairs did not scrape. People did not gasp. They recalculated. The sound of it was paper being turned purposefully. The couple at my table who had been discussing a second home in Sun Valley stopped mid-sentence. The partner with the stone cufflinks looked at my hands, as if checking whether I had always had these hands. A woman with a portfolio of polite smiles brought me another glass of water, with her eyes turned serious. Gregory stood. He had not been planning to stand. He did it with the ease of practice anyway. He said he needed a moment, and the stage appeared for him because the stage always appears for men like him. He did not take a mic. He did not have to. He walked to my side of the room and stopped 2 chairs away and looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of machinery he once sold at a discount because he thought the market would never want it. "I only finished what you once told me was worth nothing." I said the words flat and respectful, the way a tool lies flat on a bench. Conversation around us lost balance and then found a new place to stand. Gregory's eyes narrowed for a fraction, not with anger, but with recognition. Something like relief moved through his face and was gone. He nodded in a way that admitted a ledger can hold more than numbers. People turned in their seats to catch angles. The younger guests held their phones higher the way people raise candles when a song belongs to them. Someone said again, "Is that the bride's father?" And this time no one answered, because now the answer felt obvious. A board member from Hale Technologies who had laughed earlier at Brandon's joke looked down at his hands. He had stopped wearing his ring, a small story no one had asked him to tell. Lily stood then. She made no sound. She came around the table and put her palm on my back between the shoulder blades and kept it there like a lighthouse. The wet at the edge of her eyes finally fell and made a clean track that no camera could turn into anything but itself. She looked at Gregory and then at Brandon. She did not ask for anyone to behave. She simply stood with me. The room accepted her decision like weather. Brandon tried to restart the program. He gestured to the DJ who gestured to the coordinator who summoned a playlist meant for relief. It did not catch. The pattern of the night had been altered at the spine. A woman from a venture fund approached Peter and asked in a low voice if the figure was confirmed, and Peter said, "Yes." She looked at me for the first time as if looking were allowed. She said, "Congratulations," in a tone that suggested she understood calibration. At the center table, a man who had introduced himself as a family friend earlier answered a call and murmured into his hand that it was true and that the father was the founder. He said the number again, as if numbers become more real when spoken. He hung up and cleared his throat and lifted his glass toward no one, and then realized how odd that looked. and set it down unspilled. Gregory asked if we might speak later. His voice had slipped down half a register. I told him we could. I told him I was not going anywhere until my daughter wanted to leave. He nodded once and returned to his seat, as if he were walking through a new city without a map. He read the press release again, and his mouth compressed, and then relaxed, a tiny rehearsal for an apology he was not ready to make. A pocket of guests near the far wall began to hum. They were the kind who know where news goes first. One of them said the phrase, "power shift," with a crisp satisfaction. Another said the thing about background is that it sets the tone, and someone laughed, not unkindly. My line from earlier had become a proverb they could use at luncheons. The coordinator approached my shoulder with care and asked if I wanted a quiet corner. I told her I had been living in quiet corners for years and that I was fine here. She smiled without showing teeth and said if anyone gave me trouble, she would throw them out herself. I believed her. The DJ tried a standard. The couples obliged. The room moved as if it were reminding itself it could. Conversations tilted and reset. The people who mattered most in the room started deciding how to remember this moment in a way that helped them later. Some would say they had known. Some would say they had suspected as soon as I walked in. Some would say nothing and let the new alignment place them where it needed to. Peter stepped close enough that only I could hear. He said, "You okay?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I think your line will be the one they print." I said, "Let them print what they can carry." He nodded and drifted to a corner where he could watch without getting pulled. Lily squeezed my hand, twice our old code from scary nights. She whispered that she was proud of me. I felt the words move through my chest and settle where breath belongs. Brandon stood a few feet away and tried to find a place for his hands. He had always known where to put them before. Now they kept landing nowhere. A server set a dessert in front of me that looked elaborate and tasted like sugar that had worked too hard. The room stopped craning and began to look forward again, because rooms must. The clip on phones continued to climb, but it had already done its job here. It had made space for another story to enter. The chandelier light softened, as if the building understood. I let my eyes travel to the clock above the service door. 5:10. The numbers even and upright. The air in the ballroom lost a little of its glare. The people who had not noticed me before had begun practicing how to greet me without overplaying it. The people who had laughed earlier were practicing contrition in small doses. The music changed keys. The sound of the room settled into a new tempo. I sat with my daughter beside me and the truth out where it could breathe, and waited to see who would be the first to say my name aloud and mean it. Gregory stood. He walked to the small riser where the band had been and signaled for the mic. He did not start speaking. He said the company he built had benefited from work done by people who were not given the dignity they deserved. He said Lily had shown a patience that did not belong to her alone to carry. He said he took responsibility for the culture of the place that had taught his son where to stand and whom to ignore. He asked the guests to give the family a chance to do the next part in private. He promised the company would commission an independent review and publish what it found. The room went quiet. Brandon had his head down. Lily pressed her fingers to the corner of her eye, and the mascara held even as the tears did not. Gregory looked at me then. I stood. I said, "I acknowledge. The rest is for justice to handle." The quartet began to play again, as if to give the room a way to move, and people obeyed. But phones were keeping their own schedule. A guest near the donors' table was already watching the clip of Gregory's apology on a local station's live stream. The chyron at the bottom of her screen married words that rarely meet at a party. CEO apologizes publicly, founder confirmed. Peter came to my shoulder and asked softly if I needed air. I told him I was fine here. Brandon drifted away again. Gregory stayed where he was and listened to the last notes of the song with his glasses still on the piano. The program resumed. A man from a partner firm thanked the hosts for a beautiful evening and for their integrity in unexpected moments. The words landed without bruising anything. People began to stand and move toward the bar and toward small clusters where they could recalibrate their stories. Some stopped to touch my forearm with a new respect that had not existed an hour before. Some made a small bow with their head as if entering a chapel. Lily looped her arm through mine and rested her head briefly on my shoulder. She did not need to say anything. She stood with me and let the room pass by. When she lifted her head, her face had that raw clarity that comes after tears. The coordinator asked for a few minutes of attention and introduced a short video message from relatives who could not be present. Smiles returned to faces thin at first and then real. Children on the screen yelled congratulations in living rooms that looked like houses where rent is paid on time by people who do not post about it. I stepped to the terrace for air. The sky had leaned into a clean blue, and the city was cutting itself into evening. My phone buzzed with a message from Marissa that said simply, "I saw it." Good. Then another from Peter with a link to a clip already framed by a national anchor. They had taken the part where Gregory removed his glasses and the part where I answered. The anchor said words like accountability and culture and repair. There was a still of me where my tie sat quietly against the shirt Lily had chosen, and for a second I saw it as a stranger might, and felt the oddness of becoming an image that people would decide things about. In the lounge off the lobby, a television hung silent above a shelf of heavy art books. Someone had turned on captions. The nightly news opened with a wide shot of the hotel and a line that mentioned the company by name. They played the apology with B-roll of Hale headquarters and its glass and steel confidence. On the side of the screen, the words "Market Reaction Tomorrow" scrolled by. Back in the ballroom, Gregory found a microphone again. He did not speak for long. He said that a room like this can teach a person what it wants in an instant, and that he was listening. He said he would step away from the program and let the night belong to the young. He put the mic down and walked to Lily and told her something that made her look up with a search in her eyes. He turned to me and gave a small incline of his head. Brandon stayed in motion, but it had a new quality. He shook hands with men who were now careful to look away too quickly. The night leaned toward late. People who had planned to leave early stayed. People who had planned to stay all night left to make calls. A woman from a fund in San Francisco asked Peter, in a low voice, if the number could be verified twice, and he said it could. My phone buzzed again. A financial site had pushed an alert. Futures soft for Hale Technologies as news circulates of apology. I read the line and let it pass through me without heat. Numbers would fall or not. A company would respond or not. None of that changed the shape of the truth. The truth had air now. When the band packed their instruments, the DJ took over with a track that felt like a bridge. I stood at the edge with Lily and watched light move across faces. She smiled and mouthed something to me that I could not hear and did not need to hear. As the night ended in small, polite waves, the apology began to replicate itself. The hotel lobby screen showed it again now with a caption that named me and named the purchase price. Outside on the drive, a rideshare driver watched on his phone and shook his head and said to no one that people with money forget their manners. The city had caught the story and was fitting it to its patience. I walked to the curb and let the cool air sit on my skin. Somewhere upstairs, Lily was changing shoes, to walk without thinking. Gregory stood a few steps away, speaking into his phone in a voice that had lost some of its armor. Peter sent me one last message. It was a link to the national broadcast scheduled for 10. I wrote back with a single word. Scene. On the ride home later, the radio carried the top of the hour news. They played 15 seconds of Gregory and 9 seconds of me. The anchor said the market would open at 9:30 Eastern and that analysts expected a reaction. In the morning, I checked a small ticker in the corner of a financial site. The number had stepped down like a person acknowledging a mistake. I closed the page and set the phone face down on the table and listened to the apartment breathe. I poured water into a glass and drank until the glass was empty. I looked at Maria's notebook on the shelf and opened it to a page where the ink had faded only a little. I put the book back and stood by the window until the horizon let go of the night. The apology would live in clips and headlines and charts. What mattered had already happened. The truth had stepped into the room and stayed. Marissa called before the sun cleared the lip of the bay and said we would move on 2 tracks. The first would be ownership and use. The second would be reputation. I pulled the folder from the shelf and spread the pieces on my small table. Benchmarks, logs, the email from the director who had warned me to mark my borders. Marissa asked for copies and then asked for originals. She asked for dates written next to every line that mattered, and for my memory where the paper ended. By afternoon, her demand letter went out on her letterhead. It named the company cleanly and described conduct that had lived in meetings and emails and code commits. It offered 10 business days to respond with terms that did not insult what had been done. She filed the complaint the same day in federal court downtown. The clerk stamped it and slid it back without looking up. She told me not to carry anger into that building when the time came. I said I understood. I meant it. While we waited for the response, the internet did what it always does. It took the story and dressed it in its favorite clothes. Headlines traveled from local to national, passing through the hands of people who still know how to call a source and ask a clear question. The second wave focused on work the kind made in quiet that changes the daily life of strangers. That evening, the other track arrived. Brandon posted a late-night message on a platform that exists for people who think out loud with their thumbs. He dismissed the news and called me a broke guy pretending to be a genius. Marissa saw the post before I did. Her message landed with the precision of a tuned instrument. She had already drafted a defamation complaint that lived separate from the other suit. She asked if I wanted to add a personal statement. I said no. I asked her to do the speaking with the same voice she always used. By the next morning, the business press had joined the pile. Analysts wrote notes about risk and governance. The clip ran beside a photo of the glass tower with the logo that had once felt like a fact of nature. Midday, Gregory released a statement. It was 3 paragraphs of sentences that had been massaged until they had no tendons. He said he would step back from day-to-day operations while the board commissioned an independent review. He said the company would cooperate fully with whatever process was required. By the closing bell, the stock had slid more than comfort would like. A few hours later, another notice arrived for the wires. The board had suspended Brandon from his duties without a calendar attached. The phrase used was indefinite. I set the phone down and stood at the sink while the water ran and turned cold. Reporters called with voices that tried to hide caffeine. I let Peter handle most of them. When he did pass a call through, I kept my answers short. I said the work stood up. I said the paper told its story. I said kindness takes longer but lasts, and then I apologized for saying something that sounded like a bumper sticker. At the library, my class filled with faces I knew and faces I did not. I told him news is just a camera showing the same room from a new corner. We walked through setting up a photo backup on a new phone, and he wrote every step in neat cursive in a small notebook that had once been used for grocery lists. Marissa kept a clean drumbeat. She sent me copies of responses and move dates and instructions for mornings when I would need to be in a room with fluorescent lights and no windows. She asked me to keep every message even kindness. She said kindness can turn into fact when you are 3 hours into a cross-examination and do not remember your own phone number. I told her I would. The director who had written to warn me months ago sent a short email that felt like a human hand. He said he would cooperate if called. He said he hoped this would encourage other people to guard their boundaries before they were asked to give them away. I did not write back. I put the email in the folder named Signals and sat for a long minute with my eyes closed. The building breathed around me. On the third night, the evening news opened with a map of downtown and a small live window of the courthouse steps. The lower third crawled with items from the day. Board commissions review. Gregory steps back. Brandon suspended. Lawsuit seeks $47 million. He said the filings read like a ledger that knew where every dollar had gone. He said the judge would issue a scheduling order in the morning. I watched from the corner of my couch with the volume low. The camera cut to a segment that used footage from Lily's night, but they treated it carefully. They showed a wide shot of the ballroom without sound, then cut to Gregory on the stage removing his glasses, and then to me standing at my table. They allowed my line to run once and then cut back to a studio where a panel talked about corporate culture like weather. Later, my phone buzzed with a message from Lily. She said she was home. She said she loved me. She did not mention Brandon or the board or the news. I told her I loved her and that I was here. The words were not small. They were the only ones that mattered. The next day, I walked past the courthouse on my way to the bus. The plaza out front held 3 cameras and 2 people with notepads and coffee cups. The fountain threw water into the air with a stubborn optimism. I sat on a bench for a minute and watched strangers navigate their mornings. A man in a maintenance jacket rolled a cart stacked with clean linens toward a service door. Life had not adjusted its rhythm to fit my story. I felt grateful. At home that evening, I turned on the local station without sound and watched the crawl. A small green arrow showed next to one company I had never heard of. A red one showed next to Hale. I did not take pleasure in it. I stood by the window until the glass cooled and the room went darker. I could hear a train somewhere far off, that low note that says the city is doing what cities do. I took a breath that reached the bottom of my lungs and let it out slowly. No crowd, no podium. Just the simple relief of feeling that a name had been placed back where it belonged. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to explain anything to anyone. 2 months slipped past in an ordinary rhythm. I taught my classes, made coffee, walked the same street by the water, where the cranes held still like tall birds. On the 3rd morning, I answered. She asked if she could come down to Tacoma. I told her I would be home. She arrived an hour later with a paper-wrapped bundle of daisies pressed against her chest. She said, "I am sorry," in the plain way that travels. I stepped aside and told her to come in. I said, "Sit." She sat and put her hands in her lap and started to speak, and then stopped. She tried again. She said, "I was ashamed of you, and I was ashamed of being ashamed, and I did not know how to hold both." I asked if she wanted coffee. I set the mug by her and sat across from her and kept still. She told me she had gone home from that night and sat on the floor of her bedroom and read until morning. She called no one else. She said I ended it. She did not say engagement. She did not say canceled. She said I ended it in a small voice and then sat up straighter. I asked if she wanted to read the message aloud. She shook her head and said, "I know what it says." I told her thank you. I told her the room that matters is the one we are in. She tipped her head, and a tear slid to the edge of her jaw and fell. She caught her breath like a hiccup, and it steadied. When the quiet felt like an open door, I told her about the women at the library, and the way their hands hover and then land on keys, the way a screen turns from threat into tool in the space of a lesson. Lily leaned forward. She said, "This is the work." She said she had been thinking since the term sheet about the line we had tucked in, the one about educational licenses. She said the company had pledged support for a program if I ever set it up. I could see it. I could see a whiteboard full of small victories. I said we could do it if we kept clean paper on every desk. She took her notebook out of her bag, and we made a list. We wrote space and insurance and childcare and evening hours and a stipend for bus passes. We wrote curriculum, but kept it small. Learn your machine. Learn your words. Learn how to save what you make and not lose it. We wrote a line that made both of us pause. Pay what you can if you can, or pay with time by helping the next class. I said it did. We called Sandra and put the phone on speaker. She listened and said she would pull the room schedule and see what could bend. She said if we needed Sundays, she could make it happen with enough coffee. We told her we would raise money for more machines. She said she had a friend who repaired laptops for schools and owed her a favor. For 2 weeks, Lily came down twice a week, and we drew floor plans on scrap paper. We found a small storefront on a street with a bakery and a barber shop and a daycare. We filled out forms with boxes that asked whether we sold food and whether we planned to play amplified music. Lily talked to a woman at the bank who understood expanding circles and set up a simple account. I talked to Marissa about license language, and she sent back a contract that made a soft place for what we wanted to give away. The mail came late one afternoon in a stack bound by a rubber band that had learned patience. In the middle was an envelope with a familiar, careful hand. My name not printed from an assistance machine. I set it on the table. The letter was short. Gregory wrote that people do the right thing too late, and that he was trying to learn what to do after too late. He said there was no defense for the way a number had become more persuasive to him than a person. He included a check made out to me with a number that sat in my palm like a stone that had been polished by years of water. 25 million. He wrote that it was personal. He wrote that he understood if I tore it up. He wrote that if I used it in a way that made my world quieter, he would count that as a mercy. He signed his name in a hand that told me he had taken time. I set the letter on the table and slid the check toward Lily. She said, "What do we do?" I said we decide what makes our lives clean. I said I would not keep $1 of that paper in my pocket. Lily nodded and then nodded again, fast. The next morning we sat in a bank office. We named it the Maria Future Fund. We described a narrow purpose. Grants for women over 40 learning skills that let them make a living in a world that insists it is too late. Childcare and transit stipends. Emergency weeks of rent so that learning is not a luxury. We signed where the woman pointed and she slid copies into folders and checked balances in quiet clicks. Lily posted a small update that afternoon. She said a program was coming in Tacoma and that details would follow when the details were true. She named Sandra and the library and thanked people for offering to volunteer and asked them to wait for instruction. I called Peter and told him about the fund. He said he would write a short piece and that he would keep the focus on the program. He said he had talked enough about me for a lifetime and wanted to talk about the room where a woman learns to keep what she makes. I told him that was the only room worth a headline. In the evenings, Lily and I built a curriculum on my kitchen table. We broke the idea of code into objects a person could pick up and set down. We tested it with 2 of my Wednesday students who were brave enough to tell us when we were being fancy. We cut half of what we thought was necessary, and the sessions got better. We wrote a second-day script that began with remembering that yesterday went fine. On the day we signed the lease for the storefront, the landlord slid the keys across his desk with the weary smile of a man who had watched businesses try and fail and try again. Lily took a photo of me holding the keys in a hand that did not shake, and then put the phone away without posting it. She said, "Not yet." She said, "Some moments are better left to get stronger." At home that night, I stood by the window with the city dimming into its evening self. The daisies Lily had brought were still open on the table, the edges curling a little like aging photographs. I thought of Maria at the kitchen table years ago writing 2 lines to prove a day had happened. I wrote my own lines in the notebook I keep for small things that hold more weight than they look like. Today, Lily came home. Today, we began something that could carry other people. The apartment settled. Somewhere a neighbor laughed in a kitchen, and a pan hit a stove with a firm sound. I felt tired in a way that promised sleep. The keys to the storefront sat next to the folder with the fund documents. The room felt correctly arranged, not perfect, not earned beyond what we had done, simply true. I turned off the light and let the quiet hold where words had been. Quiet current found its rhythm. 2 cohorts every 8 weeks, Tuesdays and Thursdays at the library, Saturdays at the storefront, with the lights warm and the blinds half open so the block could see it belonged to them. Lily carried a clipboard and a calm that warmed a room faster than heaters. We measured wins in printed photos, first paychecks, and email subject lines that said "I did it" and meant a dozen different things. Deadlines, a hearing date, a ruling in our favor, on a motion that wanted to narrow the case and did not. I kept my hands out of the machinery. I taught an extra class on file organization and wrote a new page for the curriculum called "Keep Your Work Where the World Cannot Lose It." The women in the room nodded in a way I recognized. The nod of people who have had too many things walk off without a receipt. Hale Technologies slid and kept sliding. 70% by the time the mountaineering was done, a number that looks like gravity remembered itself. They cut costs and then cut again. The company sold its artificial intelligence division to Google at a price commentators called disciplined, and my gut called surrender. Gregory retreated from every board seat he had collected over a career. He did not call me. I did not expect him to. A card arrived at the storefront addressed to the program, not to me. It said he hoped the work would outlive all of us and enclosed a check made to the fund for a number that did not ask to be admired. I endorsed it and did not tell anyone outside the room. Brandon tried to outpace the wind. He met with firms and was told they were not hiring at this time. He sent messages to friends and got responses that read like weather reports. A recruiter I know from years ago called to ask if I would object to his name landing at a small group down in Texas. I said I do not get to decide who a person becomes. Months later, a friend sent a photo of a man who looked like him walking out of a co-working space in Austin, carrying a cardboard box that did not look heavy. The picture did not live in a story. It lived in a phone. Peter called it the father they tried to crop and the rain that kept the score. He told the story backward and forward without perfume. He wrote about code with a human voice and about grief without letting the reader off easy. A woman from my first Wednesday class wrote that the part about small wins made her cry at her kitchen table. Peter ignored the first 3 television spots and did one radio conversation where he sounded like a man who had slept 4 hours and meant every word. The celebration looked like a circle of chairs and a session where graduates taught new students what they had learned in the language they had needed. A grandmother showed how to recover a file with the confidence of a surgeon. A woman who had fled a marriage explained two-factor as if she were explaining a front door. When the hour ended, they stood in a knot near the exit and made plans to meet for coffee. Lily wrote names down and drew arrows between them. I watched and felt something unclench in the part of me that had held on to a kitchen table in a hospital room and begged a day to be kinder. I read it twice. Keynote slot on a Saturday. Theme listed in 3 words that managed to be both broad and right. Courage, repair, belonging. I waited a day, then said yes. I did not tell Lily until we were sweeping the storefront floor at closing. She leaned on the broom and grinned at me like a kid. I wrote the talk with a pencil and a stack of recycled paper. The first draft read like a deposition. The second read like a weather report. I threw both away. On the third try, I wrote it as if I were speaking to one person who had come alone and sat in the back and needed to feel less alone when she left. I told the story without the parts that were not mine. I left out numbers except where they taught something bigger. I put in the library, and the night the director sent the email that changed my posture and Maria's small notebook with the 2 lines each morning. Proof of living. I wrote my last line and read it aloud to the empty room and felt my throat build a new shape for it. The hall that day had the hum of a gym before a game. Vendor tables lined the back wall with tote bags that promised inspiration. Lily stood in the wings with a clipboard she did not need, and the patience of someone who knows sound checks are the last real test. When they called my name, I walked out, and the room felt larger than most rooms I had known and kinder. I spoke the way you speak to someone on a porch after a hard day. I talked about building something without applause and how the body learns to breathe, even when it thinks air is rationed. I said work is not a medal. It is a way to keep a promise to yourself. At the end, I said the line I had carried in my chest, like a coin you rub for luck. Justice is how we remember who we are. I let it sit in the light, and then I stepped back, because the sentence did not need me standing in front of it. The first clap arrived like a single drop on a dry road. Then the sound found itself. People stood in small bursts, and then the bursts joined, and the hall rose together. The kind of applause that makes the floorboards participate. I saw Lily look at me like I had handed her back a picture from a box she thought was gone. After the stage women lined up not for a photo, but for a minute of being heard. One told me she had returned to school at 46 and sat in the front row because the back made her feel like a shadow. Another said she had quit a job that paid well to take one that did not insult her. A third said her daughter had read Peter's piece and stopped apologizing for being brilliant. I said thank you until the word felt like a breath. I watched his face and saw the small victory that comes when a concept clicks into a place it knows as home. It looked like someone had opened a window in his head. At the storefront, the graduates had left a note on the whiteboard in block letters that said, "First paycheck, club meets Wednesday." Lily had added a heart that looked more like a square. I erased nothing. I turned out the lights and stood at the door with the keys in my hand. At home, I set the keynote pages on the table and placed a pebble from the commencement bay shore on top so they would not wander. My phone buzzed once. Peter had sent a link to his essay collected in a book with a line beneath it that said proceeds to the fund. I wrote back, "Thank you," and set the phone face down. I drew the curtains and stood with my hand on the cool glass. The city exhaled. I thought of what we had paid, and what we had kept, and what we had finally remembered, and then I let the quiet do its work. The letter inside had the clean language of the government and the word approved where a person hopes to see it. The Maria Cole Foundation for Women in Tech had been recognized by the IRS as a charitable nonprofit. I set the paper on the table and let the words settle. Lily laughed into her hands. We marked the day the way Maria would have wanted. Coffee, a plain cake, and work. Lily called our attorney in the bank. Sandra revised the schedule board at the library in her careful block letters. I carried the letter to the storefront and taped a copy inside the office door, where I would see it each time I reached for the light. A woman in a blue windbreaker said she had not been in a classroom since high school. A nurse on night shifts rubbed her eyes and said she was rusty. A grandmother traced the edge of the desk and said she wanted to stop being afraid of the wrong click. We started with ordinary things. Naming a file so you can find it again. Saving twice. Backing up to some place that is not the same machine. Fingers hovered, landed, backed away, and returned. I kept my voice low. I said we will never move faster than your hands can learn. We practiced making a folder and putting one photo inside it and finding it again. When the file appeared where it belonged, a small sound broke from the row, like something uncurling. Full house again, she said. And the waiting list is longer than the hallway. I told her we were opening a Sunday block next month. Tuesday evenings for beginners. Thursday afternoons for a small group who wanted to move from fear to fluency. Saturdays for graduates to return and teach. Lily stood in the doorway each hour as people left and said, "See you soon," in a voice that made it a fact. We wrote small checks that kept lights on and rent paid while a woman learned how to build a website for a neighborhood business. We paid a local teenager to sit with children in the story room and read until their mothers finished a lesson. The only record we kept with names was a ledger and the 2 lines each participant wrote on a note card at the end of the week. Proof of living, Maria had called it. Today, I sent my first email that mattered. Today, I made something and saved it with my own hands. Each woman said one thing she had learned and one thing she still wanted to learn. A woman with silver hair said she had learned that fear is not a tool. A woman who had raised 4 children said she still wanted to learn to stop apologizing before she pressed enter. We laughed, and then the room went quiet the way it does when truth arrives without announcement. I would sit on a bench and watch ferries move in slow, sure lines. Glass towers and sleeping bags under overpasses. Fresh paint and old scars. I kept my hands in my pockets and let the wind speak a language I did not need to translate. On one of those afternoons, Lily joined me. She had an hour between meetings and carried a clipboard covered in notes. She sat and leaned her head on my shoulder the way she had when she was small and tired after swimming lessons. She said the fund could sponsor a few more laptops if we were careful. She asked if I wanted to teach the next advanced class. I told her I preferred the first day room. The lawsuits faded into the background hum of the city, and then into the kind of quiet that means they found their endings in rooms where wood smells like polish. Marissa sent a final note with a line that read, "Resolved with prejudice," and a second line that read, "Be well." I wrote thank you and closed the file. In the fall, the foundation received its first large outside gift from a woman who had taken our Saturday class and now ran a small team that needed what she had learned to hire and keep other women. She visited the storefront and set her checkbook on the table like it was a plain tool. Keep the door open later on Thursdays so mothers who work shifts can make it. We said yes and meant it. I kept teaching the lab at the library with the same 2 sentences at the start. We will go slow. We will leave fear at the door. On one rainy night, a student brought me a photo of her holding a certificate from a city course she had finished because the computer had stopped feeling like something that belonged to someone else. She set the paper on my desk the way people set down a newborn. She said, "I wanted you to see this with your own eyes." I held the paper and told her I was proud of her, and the word did not feel small. Sometimes a reporter would ask for a comment about Hale, and I would say there was nothing left to say. Sometimes a friend would send me a link to a panel where people discussed innovation as if it were a product that could be purchased, and I would turn off the sound and watch the panelists move their hands and feel my pulse slow. On Sundays, I sit by the window and write 2 lines. Today, the class learned that saving is a kindness to your future self. Today, Lily laughed so hard at a bug in a lesson that the whole room laughed with her, and the bug sat down and behaved. Toward the end of the year, we held an open house at the storefront. The door stood open and the block came in. The barber brought coffee in paper cups. Lily thanked the neighbors for sharing parking spaces and patience. I stood near the back and listened. The sound of people who belong in a room cannot be faked. When the day wound down, I walked to the water and watched the light slip across the bay. I thought about winning and how people use the word like it requires someone else to lose. The truth is that the best kind of victory has nothing to do with a scoreboard. It has to do with remembering the shape of your own name, the sound of your own breath, the way your hands feel when they build something that does not need permission. If you have ever been made small in a loud room, let the quiet keep you. If you have ever been told to stand at the edge of the frame, step forward when you are ready and let the light find you. If this story gave you a place to stand, like it, so it stays with you, share it with one person who needs a hand on their shoulder. Subscribe to the small reminders that keep courage near. Evening leaned over Elliott Bay, and the ferries kept their lines. I stood with my hands in my pockets and felt the city breathe. Somewhere a room filled with beginners lifted their eyes to a screen and did not flinch. I turned toward home, the day behind me, complete the work ahead of me clear, and the quiet exactly where it belonged.